All right, if you are just joining us, I do have some printed outlines out on the table in the main lobby, so if you didn't have yours from last week and you would like to grab one of those, they're right outside in the main lobby. We're going to continue kind of walking down the same path that we have been going down the past couple of weeks. If this is your first night with us over the last month, my intention originally was that we would take the 4 different Wednesday nights between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and we would devote each of those Wednesday nights to a different missionary. And so I started reading some more on Lottie Moon and studying her life, thinking that she would be the first of the 4. And by the time about 4 o'clock rolled around on Wednesday afternoon, I had 72 slides for Lottie Moon. I figured that probably is not going to cut it for a 25, 30-minute Bible study. So that's why we've been looking at her life over the past couple of weeks, and we plan on doing that again next week. So we'll take a total of 4 weeks to learn about this incredible lady, Lottie Moon, as we look at this study called Here We Go, looking at her life to get us on the go. Because one of the things I've been amazed by is that the more you learn about the life of Lottie Moon, the more of an impact it will have on your own walk with Christ, because you'll realize that she is not just the fundraising face of the Southern Baptist Convention. That's certainly how we know her. Most of us hear her name, one time of year during the Christmas season, and we know the Lottie Moon Christmas offering, but very few of us know in depth the life behind that. And she was an incredible lady. I'm sure she continues to be even more an incredible lady now that she's in the presence of Jesus. And I have been greatly encouraged and challenged by looking at her life. So just a little bit of review about who she is. She was born in 1840, on December the 12th. She was born to a fairly prominent and wealthy family in Virginia. I told you that she grew up on an estate much like Monticello or Mount Vernon. Her family estate was called Viewmont, and so she had pretty much everything that she could have wanted or needed growing up. But she had a heart for missions from the time that she came to trust Christ. That was not until later in life for her. She grew up in a Christian family. Her family was always in church, but Lottie did not make that a part of her personal life until she was 19 years old, and she responded to the Lord's calling on her life at a revival at her school. She was officially called as a missionary in 1873 while she was a teacher in Cartersville, Georgia. But really, she had already had a very strong desire to be a missionary for years before that. That's when the opportunity to be a single female overseas began to come into play, and so she surrendered her life there. She set sail for China in 1873, and as you can see on the screen there, in the many, many years that followed that, we'll see, what would that be? What's that, 50 years? 40 years. In the 40 years following that, she came home 3 times. And I say she came home 3 times. She wouldn't say it that way. She would say that she came back to the United States 3 times. Because it didn't take her long living in China for China to become home for her. And when she would come back for stateside rest, called furlough back then, they don't call it furlough anymore because they recognize that when missionaries come home, and I'm sure the Seacrest can attest to this, but when a missionary comes home from the field for a brief period of time, it is not just a time of rest. It's not just vacation. That's why the Seacrests, the organization they work with, call it the home ministry assignment. So Lottie would come home to the U.S. occasionally, but only 3 times during that 40-year career as a missionary. So we talked about the fact 2 weeks ago that she became a purposeful Christian. From the very first time that she surrendered her life to Jesus, she surrendered her life to King Jesus. And she was on mission for him. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. She wasn't a perfect person, I'm sure. I'm sure she had faults just like all of us do. One of the things that I have much appreciated from hearing from Karen is that missionaries aren't perfect people. They're just people who are on mission for the Lord vocationally. But she was a Christian with a purpose. Part of that purpose was demonstrated in the fact that she loved and labored for potential Christians. She loved the lost people in China. She grew to not see them as the heathen people that the American Christians often referred to them as, but she came to recognize them as God's people who were far from relationship with Him, who needed to hear the good news of the gospel. And so she went to great lengths to carry the gospel to the people in China. Lengths much greater than just boarding a ship in San Francisco and taking a 4 or 5 week journey across the ocean, but the conditions in which she was willing to live in China, blazing a trail inland away from the coast. The significance of that, by the way, is that the coastal cities were the ones that were protected by the charter relationships between China and the U.S. So there was much more obvious safety, security, and protection in the port cities, such as Tingchao, than there were inland. And the missionaries knew that. They knew that when they ventured out of those port cities, they were leaving the safety of those treaties that the Chinese and the Americans had worked themselves into. But they did that willingly because she knew that the people of inland China needed to hear the gospel just as much as those who were on the coast. And I told you last week, I wish I had a picture that showed this well, but when we say inland, she didn't make it very far inland. I mean, China is a vast, vast place, and she may have ventured 120 miles from the coast, but she was willing to blaze that trail for the future missionaries that would come behind her, and at great sacrifice. We began to talk last week about the fact that she partnered with problematic Christians. And in case you weren't here last week, we'll do the same survey that we did last week. How many of you are problematic Christians? Every single one of us, because none of us are perfect. And so when we start to live together, when we start to bump into one another, especially in the context of ministry and missions, there are going to be problems that surface. And Lottie certainly experienced a great deal of that. I didn't give you a lot of those details last week because I didn't manage my time very well and I ran out of time. But I want to share some of those details with you to help you understand the context in which she was working and the degree to which she was a peacemaker. I think that's very, very important for us to take on because many, many times in the New Testament, we are called to be peacemakers. It's one of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called what? The sons of God. So if you want to be called one of God's children, the characteristic in your life that leads to that is that you're a peacemaker. I've noticed, and this is not original to me, I read a book that talked about this, but I've noticed it ever since I read this, that people typically fall on one side or the other of genuine peacemaking. Some of us are more naturally peace fakers, where we just pretend like everything's okay. We don't like conflict, so we don't like to voice the issues that we have. We just kind of sweep things under the rug and avoid conflict. So those are peace fakers, and that's not what God expects. That's not what He wants from us. And then other people kind of fall in the opposite extreme, and they are the peace breakers. They do, whether they like conflict or not, they find themselves in it a great deal, and they're the ones who are going to get their way, even if it hurts somebody else. But God doesn't want us in either of those places. He doesn't want us to be peace fakers who pretend like there's nothing wrong, and He doesn't want us to be peace breakers that add to the problem. He wants us to be peacemakers who acknowledge the problem, but then are part of the solution. And Lottie was a great example for us. One of those issues was Tarleton Crawford. She moved to China basically to join the missionary efforts of Tarleton and Martha Crawford. You may remember that we talked about the first week that her younger sister, her 10 years younger than her, she had a sister named Edmonia, Eddie, and she was the first of the family to go to China, and she went specifically to help Tarleton and Martha Crawford. And when she got there, she realized there's a lot of work to do here, and Lottie is probably more qualified to do this work than I am. So she started begging Lottie, you need to come over here and join us. So they joined these more seasoned missionaries who had been there longer, and there were a couple of other couples there as well who were working with them. But they weren't perfect people. This is what the biographers say about him. Tarleton Crawford was old and obstinate, and he seemed to annoy Edmonia, or her sister Eddie, at every turn. And much to Lottie's embarrassment, Eddie forgot all of her southern charm and responded with screaming and yelling. So you can imagine Lottie's dismay when she gets to the mission field, and the people she's living with, they all lived in the same house, and they couldn't get along. And it broke her heart. But that's kind of the kind of person that Tarleton had turned into over the years. And one thing in particular that Lottie had great difficulty with was the fact that Tarleton Crawford was very, very insensitive to Chinese customs. When Lottie first arrived in China, she was expecting a happy reunion with her sister Eddie, and she hadn't seen her for a couple of years, and she was looking forward to catching up. And it didn't take her long to realize that Eddie was having difficulty there, that life was not all roses there in China. And one of the problems in particular was Tarleton Crawford's insensitivity to Chinese customs. Eddie shared with Lottie that it was unheard of in China for a single female to live with a married couple. They did not understand that. They didn't understand roommates. That's not how they viewed it. How do you think the Chinese people viewed it? Well, Eddie was wife number 2, and Lottie was wife number 3. And they were incensed at the idea of these missionaries that had multiple wives. And Tarleton was just oblivious to that. Rather than communicating back with the Foreign Mission Board and saying, these living arrangements aren't going to work, we have to find some more funds to get housing for Lottie and Eddie, he just cruised along like nothing was wrong. And then to make matters worse, once Lottie arrived, now I've got 2 more people in the house, and so Tarleton's idea was, we'll just build a big tower in our compound, and we'll put Lottie and Eddie up in the tower. Well, the problem with that is, in China, they didn't really have roofs over all of their property. And so a lot of the Chinese people would use their walled-in property as a source of privacy, to have shelter from the outside world with their fences. And then here we have these missionaries that are building these tall towers, and they felt like they were spying down on the rest of the Chinese people. And when the men of the villages came to express displeasure with Tarleton, he pulled a gun on them. And Lottie was dismayed. I mean, she said, how is it that these missionaries who were here to share the gospel and the peace that only comes from Christ, we had to pull a gun on our neighbors that we're trying to share the love of Christ with? It reminded me of a story. In my previous church, we had a partnership with a ministry in Zambia. So I got to go to Zambia 4 times to help build a Bible college out in the bush of Zambia. And in the early stages, there was a lot of construction work. There was a lot of agricultural work, because part of the idea was that we were going to teach the students there how to manage a farm so they could raise a living for themselves after they left school. And so one of the strategies was that Gospel Link, which was the ministry, sent a farmer, a professional farmer, to Zambia to help be kind of the lead agricultural expert to teach the Zambian students how to farm the land, how to do certain things with the crops. Well, he got incensed that there was a neighbor cow that kept getting into his land. And he warned the neighbor a couple of times, and then he got tired of it, and he shot the neighbor's cow. He is no longer a missionary in Zambia. Gospel Link moved him back home because of his insensitivity to the people around him. And that's how Tarleton Crawford was. And Lottie had to work through that and to work with Tarleton. And if you read much about her life, you'll know that she became, really in essence, she became Chinese. I mean, she began to dress like them and look like them and eat like them and didn't want any privileges more than they had. We'll talk more about that next week when we talk about the end of her life. But she became one of them. She learned to see life through their eyes. And the reason I mention all of that is because we have to do that here. In a way, we're not living in a strange culture because this is the culture in which we live. But as I was alluding to in the prayer, the contrast between the biblical worldview and the prevailing worldview of our culture is very, very different. And if we are totally oblivious to that, and if we're oblivious to the way people outside of the church think, then instead of building bridges to reach people, we can in fact be building barriers to keep people out. Tarleton Crawford was building barriers. Lottie Moon was committed to building bridges to actually reach the Chinese people. And that's why at the end of her life, when they erected a monument to her outside of the Baptist church in Teng Chau, as I said a couple of weeks ago, the inscription was not, "Here is Lottie Moon, this wonderful missionary, or this great teacher of boys and girls school," but "Here is Lottie Moon who loved us." And we need to take that to heart. And our neighbors that we're trying to reach for Jesus, they need to know we love them. I've told you a lot about my first cousin, who's who makes a lot of life choices that I disagree with. But I have been praying for him every night for the past maybe 4 or 5 weeks, and sending him a Christmas card this year, and he's sending us a Christmas card. And one of the things I want him to know, that in spite of his life choices, that his cousin loves him. I've had some opportunities to share the gospel with him, and I don't want him to receive that from somebody that he thinks is looking down upon him. We have to be very, very careful about that. That was one of the downfalls of Tarleton Crawford's life. Another part of the problematic Christians that she had to deal with, not necessarily of their own fault, the missionaries around her, and including her, had great difficulties physically and mentally. They weren't super Christians physically and mentally. They had issues they dealt with. I was reading through the biography, and for some reason this one didn't come across very well, but hopefully you can still read this. Listen to this. So this quote here is as of 14 years into her time in China. So this is about a third of the way through her time in China. Of the 8 Baptist missionaries who had joined Lottie during her first 14 years, so she joined 2 or 3 couples already on the field, but of the 14 who joined her while she was there, 3 died, 3 returned permanently, of the 8 that went there, 3 died, 3 returned permanently to the U.S., never to go back again. That would include her sister, Eddie. 1 resigned to work for the U.S. consulate, and only 1 remained at his post. So of the 8 people that joined her as a missionary, only 1 of them was able to overcome the physical and mental hardships of living in China to be a long-term missionary. So she was dealing with some very, very difficult things. But then probably on top of all of that, there was growing unrest between missionaries like Tarleton Crawford and the FMB. What we now call the IMB was the FMB back then, the Foreign Mission Board. So back then we had the Home Mission Board and the Foreign Mission Board. And many of those missionaries, kind of led by Tarleton Crawford, began to have a lot of contempt to the Foreign Mission Board for telling them how to be missionaries in China. Their mindset was, we got people living in America who are telling us how to be missionaries in China. They're basically writing the rules for us, telling us what we can do and what we can't do, and they don't understand our culture. And so when Tarleton Crawford would come home, when Lottie would come home, the 3 times that she came, she would go around to women's missionary unions and churches, and she would raise not just financial support, but prayer support. She would be telling people how things happen on the field and how they can be praying. And Tarleton Crawford would come home, and he would do this. He would badmouth. He basically went on a bad-mouthing tour, and you can imagine what great things that led toward, right? And so we got to be careful that we don't do that. We got to be careful that the issues inside the church don't make their way outside of the church. See, what's interesting is that when you read the biography, Lottie actually agreed with a lot of the things that Tarleton was talking about. But she knew that Tarleton wasn't going about them the right way. You don't accomplish change by complaining about things. You accomplish change through education. You accomplish change through working together for people to understand your point of view. And see, in the middle of all that, she had to learn to be a peacemaker. Here's that beatitude that we talked about a few moments ago. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. I see some relationship between those 2 beatitudes. Probably more so in studying the life of Lottie Moon. I've seen a connection, because you are much more likely to be a peacemaker and to go after the things that matter most if you have a purity in heart and your motives are pure. Now, see, for Lottie, this wasn't a career. It wasn't a way to get rich. It wasn't a way to get away from her family. She was there to reach the people of China. She was there to share the love of Christ, and she knew that conflict in the camp was not going to accomplish that. And she was willing to go to great lengths and sacrifice a lot personally in order to be that peacemaker. So Lottie partnered with problematic Christians. But she also comforted persecuted Christians. This is one area of her story, really both of those areas, but especially this one, I'd never really thought about before. You know her as the fundraiser, as the champion for international missions, but when you read her story, the Lord used her in incredible ways in comforting, encouraging, and leading persecuted Christians. Now, we're not in this context, so I don't want to make application points out of this that minimize the kind of persecution I'm talking about. And so I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to say, they were being persecuted for their faith. Let's be willing to endure persecution. It's not even on the same plane. The reason I'm including this portion is because I think this is one way that we can be trained to pray better for our missionaries. To be more understanding of the things that they are going through. That's not just being away from their family, but to truly lift them up in the Lord and to encourage them in prayer and to partner with them by lifting them up. So that's why I wanted to share some of this stuff with you. One category that she dealt with regularly, because she had a ministry to single women, she often found that the women that she was ministering to, if they came to Christ through her teachings, then if either they were already engaged or they became engaged to be married after that, there was great price to be paid because they were typically arranged marriages with non-Christian men. And so lots of stories in her biography about the heartache and the persecution that these women endured, often being killed because of their newfound faith in Christ. There's a wonderful section of the biography that tells the story of a man named Lee Keen and his nephew Lee Shoting. I want to share a few quotes with you from the book that will help you get the sense of this portion of the story of persecution. So in Xialing, there was an old man by the name of Lee Keen who had been attracted to Christianity by the lively singing. That was one of the ways they drew a crowd, was they would have worship services in public, and he was very drawn to that. He was drawn to the singing, And because he would come to the meetings for the singing, he was then hearing the gospel and hearing the word of God read and hearing the truth about Jesus. And one day he stood up at a meeting and told everyone that he wanted to be a Christian. He wanted to be a follower of Jesus. And so Lottie gave him a New Testament, which he treasured, even though he could not read a word of it. He still treasured it. He knew it was God's word. And so it was a great treasure for him. But his family, much like the women who came into difficulty because of non-Christian family, his sons were furious. They were not Christians. They didn't want him to be Christians, or him to be a Christian. It says they hit him, spat on him, locked him away in the storage room. But still he sang happily of the God who loved him. And the book said that occasionally he would find opportunities to escape, and he would go to Lottie for encouragement. Not to escape the situation altogether and to run away and never go back, but just because he knew Lottie would encourage him and give him words of wisdom and pray for him before he would go back to his children and endure more of that torture and more of that kind of mental abuse that they gave him because of his willingness to follow Christ. So they kept at him, this was very interesting. Lottie encouraged him to endure persecution, assuring him that God would bring good out of the situation. And then the book talks about those treaties that the Chinese had with the Americans. And part of that treaty were that the Christian missionaries were to be protected, and that those who became Christians as a result of the missionaries' work there, that they were also to be protected. That was part of the treaty. And so Lottie had to decide, are we going to use that to our advantage? Or are we going to call in basically the army from Ting Chao and bring them here to stop the persecution? And it says she decided it would be a mistake to call in soldiers to stop the persecution because it would confuse the Chinese people. They would begin to think that Christians just used force when they didn't get their way. So instead of looking to the outside authorities, Lottie just encouraged the Christians, we need to be willing to endure persecution. Our Lord Jesus was persecuted. We're not any greater than he is. We need to be willing to endure this, but we also need, in the midst of that, to hear God's promises that he's going to be with us. He's going to never leave us or forsake us, and he's going to use it for our glory and for his glory. And we certainly see that in Lee Keen's life. So his family, Lee Keen is still undergoing this mental abuse, this ongoing persecution, and his family couldn't get to him. No matter what they did, no matter how long they left him locked in the closet, no matter how much they made fun of him and spit on him and hit him, he would not abandon Christ. He was standing true to Jesus in the midst of that, so they decided they were going to change their strategy. So they brought in his nephew, Lee Shou-ting, who was a very educated man, and they said, okay, we think the problem here is that Lee Keen doesn't know what he's following. He can't read the Bible, so he's just reliant upon the missionaries, and they're just telling him all this stuff. So they brought in Lee Shou-ting to read the Bible to Lee Keen. And Shou-ting was excited about this opportunity because he was going to take every chance he could to make fun of Christianity and to ridicule their beliefs and stop along the way and do all of that. And it says he set out to mock the teachings of Jesus, and you know where this is going, right? And as he read aloud, he was held spellbound by what he read, and it made more sense to him than any teachings of Confucius. And before long, he became a Christian, just like his uncle. And the book says, although Lee Keen had endured much pain and insult, the entire church saw the good that had come from his persecution. Lee Shou-ting would go on to become a serious Bible scholar and would baptize over 10,000 people. God is going to bring good out of the suffering of his people. There's no doubt about that. And the reason we know that is because he tells us that. Even if the good is not 10,000 converts, it may be the growth of your spiritual life 10,000 times because of the presence of the Lord in your life. That's why Jesus said in Matthew 5:10-13, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." What greater reward could there be than to have ownership in the kingdom of heaven? Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely. Remember what I told you a couple weeks ago, that usually when people saw Lottie for the first time, this foreign woman who was there in their culture, they would call her a devil. They didn't understand why she was there. They said horrible things about her. And Jesus said, "Blessed are you when people revile you on my account." Now, I think we got to pause right here and just remember that we are not blessed when people revile us because of our own stupidity or because of our own crotchetiness, to lack a better term. You know, Tarleton Crawford was being reviled by the Chinese people, but not because of his righteousness, not for the sake of Jesus, but because he was difficult to get along with. But Jesus says, when you are being persecuted for following me, you are blessed. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And Lottie took that verse in particular to heart. And so much of what she did to encourage the Chinese Christians who were undergoing persecution is she told them stories from the Old and New Testament of the people of God who were persecuted for their beliefs. And she said, God was with them, he'll be with us. You know, some of them died, like Stephen. God was with them, he'll be with us. Some of them lived, like Paul. God was with them, he'll be with us. But she told him those stories of God's faithfulness to his people. Lottie told those who were continuing to bring persecution upon them, she said, if you try to destroy the church and the Christians who worship in it, you'll have to kill me first. She actually, these words are recorded by her in the midst of very, very intense persecution in which her life was being threatened. She ran to the aid of a pastor who was being beaten. And she basically jumped between the pastor and the one who was beating him and said, if you're going to try to kill the church here, you got to kill me first. She said, Jesus died for me, I'm ready to die for him. And the witnesses who were around said that the guy raised his sword to kill Lottie, and then all of a sudden, for no reason, his sword dropped out of his hand and his hand fell limp. Just great protection that God offered to Lottie in that particular moment. One of the intense periods of persecution came in the midst of the Boxer Rebellion. Now, I'm not a history professor. I don't know everything that led to and came out of the Boxer Rebellion in the early 1900s, but I know one part of it was that the Boxers, they hated the presence of foreigners in China. So they were out basically to stamp out the presence of foreigners, and you can imagine what that meant for Lottie and those who were following Jesus there. It said that in the Hebei province, there were 16 missionaries who were stoned and beheaded on June 28, 1900. In a different province in July, there were 46 missionaries and Christians who were killed. They were killing some of the best people in the country. And because of this, that was one period in which Lottie did flee from China. At the begging of the Foreign Mission Board and the U.S. Embassy in China, the missionaries fled to Japan for a while during the most intense days of persecution during the Boxer Rebellion. But then they were very, very glad when they had the opportunity to come back. And listen to what God did because of the persecution. When Lottie returned to Tengchao, she found more open doors than ever before. The local people want to know what power was so strong that it would cause a Christian to die with dignity and hope. And hundreds became Christians. So what power was so strong that a Christian would be willing to die with dignity and hope? Well, we read about that power in 2 Corinthians 4, 7 through 12. We have this treasure, the treasure of the surpassing greatness of the glory of God that shines out of our life as light shining into the darkness. That's basically what verse 6 is talking about. We have this treasure in jars of clay, which means that our bodies are feeble vessels, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but we are not crushed. We are perplexed, but not driven to despair. We are persecuted, but not forsaken. We are struck down, but not destroyed. And then Paul says, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. And that's exactly what happened through the lives of those in China who were willing to die for the name of Christ. They were carrying around in their bodies the death of Jesus, and through that, the life of Jesus was being manifest. And then Paul concludes that passage by saying, for we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. It's a good place for us to pause and to ask ourselves a question and then to pray. What does it look like in our life for death to always be at work in us? What does that mean? Does that mean that we're supposed to be morbid people? No, that means that we are supposed to die to Christ, to die for Christ and to our sin on a regular basis, and continually be willing to live a life that demonstrates death to self and life in Christ. For me, to live is Christ and to die is gain. When people begin to see that in our life, when they begin to see that we're not living for our own pleasures, our own comforts, our own pursuits, but that we're willing for all of that to die so that we can pursue a relationship with Christ and His relationship through us, then the death as at work in us offers life to those around us. So God's not calling all of us to be like Him. He's not calling all of us to go to China, although I certainly hope over the next several years He'll call a few from our church to go on international missions and say yes to that. But He's calling all of us to die to self. He's calling all of us to live lives that are in stark contrast to the darkness around us. Not in a way that is crotchety, like Tarleton Crawford, but in a way that is winsome and attractive, like Lottie Moon. And that only comes if it's Jesus doing it and not us. See, if we just try to do it on the outside, we can just, do kind of behavior modification stuff, and our heart will still be bitter. But if we'll die to self and allow Christ to grow in us, His life is so much more attractive than ours. So that's the life that would let spill out of us, much like she did. Let's pray together.